Should you use custom keybinds in World of Warcraft? The short answer? Probably. However, it really depends on two main factors. First, your goals with the game, and second, personal preference. Obviously, if you're a huge fan of the default keybinds and are doing just fine with them, then of course, continue using them. But if there's some metric in which you're looking to improve in terms of your in-game performance, whether that be keeping up with a fast-paced rotation, or just being more reactive during unexpected situations, then taking the time to reevaluate your keybinds is usually a pretty good place to start. But before we start changing anything, for the sake of clarity, let's briefly go over the three different types of keybinds you'll have to consider. First, there's action bar keybinds for triggering any item or spell placed on the action bar. Second, there's movement keybinds for changing the position of the character or the camera. And thirdly, there's UI keybinds for all the various interface panels like your bags, character pane, etc. Now, I won't really be spending a whole lot of time talking about these ones since they're not super important in terms of optimizing performance, at least in relation to combat, which is the main reason why when most people are talking about keybinds, they're usually talking about these two types. But now that that's all cleared up, let's talk about the pros and cons of the default control setup. Since this is, well, the default, if this is what you started with and have been using for quite some time, then obviously these keybinds are going to be the most familiar, and you probably already have muscle memory for them. All of your main action bar buttons are organized neatly into a row, your movement options are pretty standard and easy to grasp, and while it may take a moment to memorize some of the UI keybinds, a few of them do use mnemonic associations, like C for character pane, B for bag, M for map, and so on, which makes them easier to remember. So what about the drawbacks? Well, the most glaring issue of the default setup is mainly just the single action bar, which is quite limiting. Of course, this is often fixed by adding additional bars through the game's settings, but since these additional bars don't have any binds assigned by default, that means you'll have to manually click them in order to use them. Now, only having a single bar of buttons connected to the keyboard is less of an issue depending on your class, what version you play, and the range of activities you engage in, or whether or not you use the rotation assist button in retail, which, if you are using that, I'm not entirely sure what you're doing here, but moving on. Even if you are able to fit all your most common abilities onto the main bar, not having dedicated keybinds for the other bars can make it harder for some players to remember where some of their more situational items and abilities are. And while this can be mostly resolved by having a consistent organization system, if your main concern is reaction time, it's pretty much always going to be faster to have a dedicated keybind for these buttons. The other thing to consider in relation to speed is the distance your hand needs to travel in order to use all of your keyboard abilities. For most video games, many players tend to rest their right hand on the mouse and the left hand right about here, with the pinky on the shift key, the ring finger on A, the middle finger on W or S, the index finger on D, and then the thumb on spacebar. And this tends to be the standard in WoW as well, with players moving their fingers upwards to reach their abilities during combat. And while there's not a whole lot of travel going on to reach buttons 1 through 4, any button from about 5 and onward can start to be a bit of a stretch, especially for those with shorter fingers, usually requiring a full repositioning of the hand, which, in addition to being a tad bit slower, makes it harder to fine-tune your position during a fight, since you're constantly being pulled away from the movement keys. Which also leads us into the most common issue people tend to have with the default controls: the movement keys. And if you've ever been called, or called someone else, a keyboard turner, you probably already know what I'm talking about. As you may know, the two main ways to turn both your character and the camera at the same time are by pressing A and D, or by dragging the mouse while holding right-click. And while throughout the years there has been much debate on which is better, the benefits of each system tend to boil down to mouse turning being superior for speed and more accurately tweaking the camera position, and keyboard turning being better for when you want to watch Instagram reels while you run across the zone. Of course, use whichever you prefer, but if you do choose to turn with the mouse, then that decision will essentially leave A and D as dead or redundant keybinds, which is usually why one of the first keybind changes a lot of players tend to make is to move their strafing binds from Q and E down to A and D, as strafing is often very important for fine-tuning your position during an encounter, with two examples being when kiting a mob at full speed, or when casters need to quickly step out of AoE while maintaining max range. But now that we've discussed the benefits and drawbacks of the default setup, let's now cover the two main keybind philosophies that I tend to see: mnemonics and speed. And since most of the drawbacks I mentioned for the default setup were already kind of speed related, I'm going to pivot for a moment and cover mnemonics first, since this is the one where, rather than focusing entirely on reducing reaction time as much as physically possible, it's more about reducing reaction time in a comfortable, low-stakes kind of way that largely focuses on creating a system that's easy to remember. In everyday terms, a mnemonic device is any kind of strategy that aids in the memorization of something by associating it with something else. And a common example of math is the phrase, "Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally," which is actually a two-step mnemonic device, as this phrase is typically used to remember the acronym PEMDAS, which is then used for the order of operations when solving an equation. Now, I mentioned earlier that the default setup uses this same concept for some of the UI keybinds, and so this strategy essentially does the exact same thing, but to a larger scale, by also incorporating combat or movement actions to certain letters. Of course, there are tons of different ways to go about this depending on how you like to remember things, but let me just give you a few examples to demonstrate the idea. 1, 2, 3, and 4 could be the first, second, third, and fourth buttons in your combat rotation, or the priority list of abilities if your rotation isn't set in stone. R could be for a ranged pull, X could be for execute, C could be for crowd control, B could be for buffs, H could be for a heal. I think you get the idea. And while this obviously isn't the fastest type of setup, often requiring multiple repositionings of the hand to perform the various actions, but since this method is more so about tying consistency to memorization tactics, speed really isn't the primary issue here, and if all you're looking for is a moderate improvement to reactivity, I would argue that this system, or really any keyboard-centric system for that matter, where inputs are essentially boiled down to a binary system of on or off, will almost always be quicker than a clicking-based system, where you have to account for inconsistent travel distance depending on the current position of the mouse, and where you have the possibility of moving too far or not far enough, and missing the click entirely. But moving away from speed, the other main downside to mnemonics-based key bindings is that it can sometimes feel pretty cluttered, since it basically turns the entire keyboard into a chaotic mess of different keybind types. If that doesn't really bother you, then this isn't really much of an issue, but if you can't stand the overall lack of visual organization, then perhaps you should consider something more along the lines of a speed-based setup. As we discussed earlier, the entire point of speed-based keybinds is to minimize travel across the keyboard, and I found that the best way to accomplish this is by separating the keyboard into two sections, where combat and movement keybinds are on the left side, and then pretty much everything else is on the right. And since this is the strategy that I personally use, I'll be using my keybinds as an example. Now, at first glance, my setup will probably seem a little strange, mainly because I use add-ons to drastically overhaul my UI, and also because my action bar layout is entirely arbitrary, but that's not really the point, as the main focus point here is more so on the placement of the individual keybinds on the keyboard rather than the organization of them on screen. So let's start with my main bar. Out of all the original main bar buttons, the only ones I've kept default are 1 through 4, and for the rest, I like to use all the keys in this general area surrounding the movement keys, those being Q, E, R, F, Z, X, C, and V. And while I don't really have mnemonic associations for these keys, I do give each one a mostly consistent function across all the different classes that I play. And the general idea is that 1 is the most commonly pressed ability, usually a builder if the class follows the common builder-spender archetype, 2 is the second most common, 3 is usually a spender ability or something with a longer cooldown, and 4 is either an execute or anything else that's missing from the core of my rotation. Moving on to the letters, Q and E are usually for instant cast AoEs or instant cast ranged abilities. R is my initiator, so either a charge or some kind of ranged ability that I really only use for pulling, such as a down-ranked version of Moonfire or just a straight-up ranged weapon. F is for taunt or a threat reducer if I have one of those instead of a taunt. V is for stuns and other CC options. C is for more important or situational AoE abilities, usually ones with a cast time, channel, or just a longer cooldown. X is for my interrupt, and Z is for big offensive buffs. Now, I'll cover the rest of my bars a little bit later, but since that's pretty much the basic idea, let's pause for just a moment and consider some of the potential drawbacks of this kind of system. First of all, the button assignments are entirely arbitrary, and in my case, it took several years of playing and adjusting based on different class abilities and what generally felt natural for me until I finally arrived at the system I use today. The other potential issue here is that since everything important is all clustered together, forming a misinput is much more likely to waste an important resource or mess up your rotation. So for an example, on another bar, I have my health potions bound to the tilde key, because it's super easy to find on the keyboard and it's very close to everything else. But because it's so close to my combat abilities, I can't tell you how many times I've accidentally wasted a potion when I've gone to press 1 and the edge of my finger just barely clipped the edge of the tilde key. Could that be resolved with a more thought out system? Probably, but every key position has different benefits and drawbacks, especially when I'm limiting myself to only about a third of the keyboard. So while yes, moving my health potion key would probably reduce the amount of wasted potions, I would also lose the convenience and speed of having a panic button so close to my usual combat keys. Is that worth the trade-off? Not to me, but to some people, maybe it is. And that's probably the hardest part about speed-based keybinds, finding the balance between comfort, optimization, and muscle memory, all while taking into account the benefits and drawbacks of each individual key placement. But now that we've covered the two main philosophies, I want to talk about another problem that you may run into. And while speed-based keybinds are likely going to run into it a bit earlier than mnemonics ones will, it's still something that most players will probably run into regardless of their keybind system. There aren't enough keys. How can you possibly create a system that accounts for every single type of spell while sticking to a set system of keys and without compromising your UI and movement keybinds? And not to mention, how do you deal with classes that have two different abilities that essentially fill the same role? Well, you could just go and buy a keyboard with a bunch of extra buttons, but if you don't already have one of these, let me be the first to tell you that most of the time, these extra buttons aren't actually extra buttons. And most of the time, they're just macro keys for a quick way to execute a combination of existing keys. That's not to say they're not useful, as key combinations are probably the literal best way of gaining access to more keybinds, but before we get into that, I want to discuss a smaller technique we can utilize to slightly cut down on the need for extra keys, at the cost of a little bit of extra complexity to our system. Flex buttons. Earlier I mentioned that I like to keep my instant cast AoEs on Q, but what about when I'm playing a rogue? And while sure, some iterations of the class do have access to abilities like Fan of Knives, this isn't always the case, like in Classic, or when playing an Outlaw Rogue, which is my preferred spec on the occasional occasions when I'm playing a Rogue when I'm occasionally playing Retail. And so, if I were to strictly adhere to my organizational system, then anytime I play a Rogue, that would leave Q as an entirely dead keybind, which is quite a shame given its unique placement on the keyboard, right next to the movement keys, where I can still press it while moving in any direction other than left. So, because this is such a desirable position for an ability, I often end up using it more as a flex button, where rather than strictly using it for instant cast AoEs, I'll also allow for class-specific abilities, such as Stealth, to be in this spot whenever I'm playing a class that doesn't have an instant cast AoE, or if the instant cast AoE that they do have isn't quite as important or is used rather infrequently. And this is why I said earlier that my keybinds only have mostly consistent purposes, because while a fully consistent system is consistent, perfect consistency tends to come at the cost of needing a lot of keybinds, especially if you play lots of classes. And this is just another one of those trade-offs that really depends on personal preference, because while a huge list of unique keybinds that accounts for every single type of action isn't really an issue for some people, if you're like me, then you probably don't want to memorize that many keybinds. And so the trade-off here is that in order to reduce the complexity of the memorization list, we're adding a bit of complexity to our organizational system in the form of flex buttons. And just like with Q, the main reason I prefer this trade-off is because it gives me enough flexibility to keep all my most important abilities on the keys with the most advantageous positions on the keyboard, specifically in regards to how quickly you can access them from the standard hand position. However, even with the addition of flex buttons, you will still likely run into the issue of not having enough keys, especially if you're like me and want everything to be quickly accessible, or again, if you have multiple abilities that fill the same role. So what do we do here? Let me introduce you to the beauty of modifier keys. What if I told you that with a push of a button, you could have a way to completely free up every single button in your setup, essentially doubling, tripling, quadrupling, quintupling, sextupling, septupling, or even octupling the amount of keys at your disposal? Surely there's no such thing. Say hello to Shift, Control, and Alt, or in other words, modifier keys. By holding one of these down, you gain access to an entirely clean slate of keys, free to be bound to whatever action your heart desires. And even if you fill one of those slates, don't worry, you've still got two more. And if you somehow manage to fill those, just start modifying modifiers with modifiers. Are Shift-E, Control-E, and Alt-E already taken? Try Shift-Control-E, or Shift-Alt-E, or even Shift-Control-Alt-E. The combinations are infinite. Well, technically not infinite, since there's a finite amount of keys, and you're also limited to a certain amount of action bars, but like theoretically, there's way more than you can possibly use. So what do I use modifiers for? Well, mainly just to give myself fresh copies of the keys that I already like to use. So for example, the topmost bar in my setup is actually an exact mirror of the keys below it on the main bar, but with the shift modifier attached to them. And pretty much the entire purpose of this bar is for any core rotational ability that doesn't already fit on the main bar, and then for abilities that are very similar to the ability directly below it. But what about all my other bars? Well, these are mainly just used for situational stuff, with the rightmost one being for healing, with a few variations on the tilde key for potions, health stones, bandages, or any kind of self-healing ability. As for the blank spaces, I do also tend to use these for standard healing spells, but mostly just for a visual, since whenever I'm playing a healer, I tend to use click casting in combination with modifier keys so that I can heal by directly clicking on the player portraits. And while click casting is still technically connected to keybinds, it's a little bit beyond the scope of this video, so let's just move on to the rest of my bars. I also have a left bar built around variations of minus and equal sign for long-term buffs like Mark of the Wild or Arcane Intellect, or just any spell or ability with a particularly niche use case that doesn't really fit anywhere else. And then finally, I have this bar on the bottom, with the first half built around 5 and 6 for cleanses, 7 for my racial ability, 8 and 9 for trinkets, and 0 for slows. But Rel, you may be asking, didn't you say to keep everything on the left side of the keyboard? Yes. However, this is where we bring those macro keys specific to hardware back into play. And while I do have some extra keyboard keys, I primarily like to cheat by using an MMO mouse with lots of extra buttons on the side, specifically the Logitech G600, which has unfortunately been discontinued. So whenever this thing breaks, I'm not really going to be very happy because there's no way I'm paying a reseller $240 for a mouse that I got for $30. But that aside, while I am technically using keystrokes that are far away from the standard position, I never actually have to move my hand to that specific key because the macro keys on my mouse are essentially just copies of those keys but in a more desirable location, which opens up a lot more possibilities for my keybind system. So with that in mind, despite this bar being set apart for situational abilities, all of the keybinds on it are still very accessible, with all of these buttons being tied to the macro keys and the rest being tied entirely to the scroll wheel, with middle mouse and shift middle mouse for movement abilities, and then mouse 4 and 5 plus shift variants for defensives. Although, quick side note, this position for mouse 4 and 5 isn't universal across mice. So even though mine trigger by rocking the scroll wheel left or right, assuming that your mouse actually supports these buttons in the first place, it's possible that they're bound to dedicated buttons. The only real tricky part here though is that they're not always referred to as mouse 4 and mouse 5, and oftentimes they're just called back or forward, since most internet browsers include them as shortcuts for quickly going back and forth between pages. But moving on, after all is said and done, and if you've decided that you might want to give alternate keybinds a chance, there's still one big question left unanswered. Where do I start? Once again, I've got two options for you, the slow and steady method or the brute force method. Slow and steady essentially just means don't rush it. You don't need to change everything all at once just because some guy on the internet told you to. Just start small with 1 or 2 minor adjustments. For years, the only thing I'd ever changed was moving my strafe keybinds down to A and D, and I didn't start messing with anything else until Legion, when I started using Q and E for a more natural way to trigger my Demon Hunter's movement abilities. But after that small taste, whenever I was using other abilities, I constantly found myself wondering, I wonder if there's a faster way to do this. Sometimes the binds didn't pan out and I ended up switching them back right away, but sometimes they stuck, and eventually I got to the mess of a system I use today. Brute forcing, on the other hand, usually involves completely changing your entire control scheme from whatever it is currently to something drastically different. And if you're not already a keybind aficionado, that probably just means something you found on the internet, which is totally fine, but depending on your current muscle memory, and generally depending on the way you process things, it's possible that this route may end up being a lot more frustrating. Because instead of slowly evolving your setup to your specific needs, what you're essentially doing is trying to rapidly reprogram your brain into using a completely new system of muscle memory that you have no prior experience with. Now, if you can do that, that's awesome. And in some cases, I can definitely see how trying to learn a completely foreign control scheme could be really helpful in determining what you like and what you don't like, making it easier to adjust to your needs once you get the hang of it. But if you can't really do that, I'm willing to bet that you'll probably find the whole thing far more frustrating than it's worth, and it might leave a pretty sour taste in your mouth when it comes to keybinds as a whole. But to wrap things up, that's pretty much the general idea when it comes to keybinds. First, figure out what kind of player you are and what your goals are, and if you think keybinds might help, then figure out what style you prefer, and then do a bit of testing. And don't be afraid to try brute forcing if it sounds enticing, but if that doesn't work out, definitely still give the slow and steady approach a try and see if you can find at least one new keybind that might make something easier. And then, who knows, maybe someday your action bars will look a total mess, just like mine do. But you know what? Even if no one else understands it, you will. And at the end of the day, that's all that really matters. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a like, and if you have any suggestions for future videos, whether that be more guide kind of stuff like this or whatever you want to call it, new challenge run ideas, or anything else you might want to see, or if you just want to share your personal experience with keybinds, feel free to leave a comment. But that's pretty much all I have for you. So, thanks.